time. So, dear friends, dear Kent, good evening and welcome to this gathering. It is my distinct honor and privilege as the president of the Hungarian Shakespeare Committee to open our first public scholarly lecture of the year. Reflecting on our recent milestone, we find ourselves in the afterglow of our 10th, 11th anniversary celebration. It was more than a decade ago that our committee was formed, driven by a shared passion for the works of William Shakespeare and a commitment to deepening the understanding and appreciation of his contributions to literature and theatre. Over the past 11 years, we have engaged in numerous activities ranging from academic conferences and educational outreach to publication projects that have significantly advanced the study and enjoyment of Shakespeare in Hungary and hopefully beyond. Our anniversary celebration was not only a time to reflect on our past achievements, but also an opportunity to reaffirm our mission and set our sights on future endeavors. As we move forward, we're committed to expanding our horizons, fostering scholarly dialogue and engaging a broader audience in Shakespeare scholarship. Tonight, we inaugurate the first public lecture of the year. As we convene for this inaugural lecture, let us remember that Shakespeare's genius lies not only in his profound grasp of the human condition, but also in his ability to speak across centuries, cultures, and disciplines. His works continue to resonate, challenge, and inspire, and it's our responsibility as scholars and enthusiasts to ensure that his legacy endures and thrives. I extend my heartfelt thanks to all of you for your presence here tonight. And with this, I give the floor over to Attila to introduce Kent and the lecture as well.
Thank you very much, Zsolt. I am extremely delighted and greatly honored to present our lecturer today. I am presenting Professor Kent Cartwright because he hardly needs any introduction. I'm quite sure we are all familiar with his extensive and internationally acclaimed scholarship. We have been using so many of his important publications. I would just like to list these as a reminder. His first book, Shakespearean Tragedy and its Double, The Rhythm of Audience Response, came out in 1991. And then his second hugely influential book, Theatre and Humanism, English Drama in the 16th Century, came out in 1999. He was editor of the Arden edition of the Comedy of Errors in the third series in 2017. He also edited the companion to Tudor literature in 2011, and his most recent volume came out with Oxford University Press in 2021, Shakespeare and the Comedy of Enchantment. I think you will rely on considerations in that book in today's presentation. That's my assumption. Professor Cartwright is Professor Emeritus at the University of Maryland, where he has also served as chair of the University Senate. He also acted as chair of the Department of English for long periods. He also served as trustee of the Shakespeare Association of America, and he also worked as president of the Association of Departments of English in the United States. And last but not least, I am extremely proud to share with you a very recent excellent piece of news, because quite recently the Senate of the University of Szeged unanimously voted that the title of Doctor Honoris Causa should be conferred upon Professor Cartwright. So we are all very happy about that, and I am extremely proud to present him today as the new honorary doctor of the University of Szeged. Kent, please, the floor is yours. I'm very happy to present you.
Thank you, Attila and Zsolt. And let me just add that I'm deeply moved to be honored by the University of Szeged, and I look forward to coming there in November. I'm going to put on my share screen now in hopes that I can get my PowerPoint up. There we go. Okay. I'm assuming that's can be seen by all now. And I'll begin. I've prepared this talk as a way of bringing together strands from 4 current projects. First, I've been working on an intended book manuscript entitled Reading After the War. It's about reading theory after World War I, with special attention given to I.A. Richards of Cambridge University and the social and cultural context in which he was writing. Richards is recognized, of course, as the founder of modern Anglo-American criticism and the theorist of its still dominant teaching methodology, close reading. His most famous work is Practical Criticism from 1929. A second project is my ongoing research on dramatic comedy in general and Shakespeare's comedies in particular, which were the subject of my 2021 book, Shakespeare and the Comedy of Enchantment, and which I returned to in my talk on Measure for Measure at the Szeged Iconology Conference last July. A third project is an essay that I have recently been commissioned to write about the relation of Ludovico Ariosto's comic writing to that of Shakespeare. The essay is intended for a collection on Ariosto's influence in the English Renaissance. The fourth project is not a piece of writing, but rather an ongoing conversation that I've been having with several of you and others about the future of the humanities, especially literature. My talk will have 3 parts, as you can see on the screen, and I've color-coded them as we go along, so I'm not going to go through all of that. The first section is on I.A. Richards' theory of literature. What can literature teach us about how to be? By which I mean how to find a perspective or way of seeing and responding, a stance that gives us the best chance for a fulfilling life. The problem is especially acute in times such as ours, when political values and cultural values can sometimes seem out of sync. On the question of how a person should be, I.A. Richards has something to offer. My comments draw especially from his early works, The Foundation of Aesthetics, 1922, The Principles of Literary Criticism, 1924, and Science and Poetry, 1926. Formulating his theory of reading after the devastation and upheaval of the Great War, Richards was attempting to address the urgent problems of change, social disruption, and moral uncertainty that he saw around him. New social conditions, exacerbated by the war, were challenging traditional models of value and were demanding that the individual respond to his or her world with a self-conscious sense of expansiveness. To live reasonably, he said, is not to live by reason alone, but to live in a way of which reason, a clear, full sense of the whole situation, would approve. The way of such wholeness is the way of poetry, in essence, of literature. And let us stipulate here that for our purposes, when we say poetry, we will mean literature. Richards seeks to analyze poetry's effects on the reader and to identify the personal and social implications of those effects. That is, how literature moves us and what difference it makes. Richards takes from psychology a description of the human psyche as a complicated system of drives, desires, feelings, assumptions, thoughts, and beliefs, which he called impulses. They are cultivated variously by biology, upbringing, social circumstance, and experience. Impulses come in different intensities and are subject to change over a long duration or even from moment to moment, all jostling, sometimes competing against each other. Human experience, then, becomes the individual's ongoing effort to achieve psychic equilibrium or organization or order, an adjusted selfhood in which impulses are in rough balance, if not harmony. It is achieved by the psyche's empowering of some impulses and its subordinating, sublimating, releasing, or deferring of others. For Richards, an individual's repeated encounter with literature offers a mechanism for achieving that equipoise. A poem activates our emotional and mental impulses, and it does so. As it does so, it reorganizes them according to a new sense of provisional stability. Conflicts and tensions may not be resolved, but they will offset each other. That is, a literary work can end inconclusively in certain ways. It can have loose ends, as my discussion of comedy will illustrate, but it will still set forth a system of effects that are structurally connected. Richard's model tolerates a good bit of discontinuity. He was, after all, one of the first critics to write admiringly of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. A poem will work its magic on us, furthermore, only if we engage with it closely and scrupulously, immersing ourselves in its details, patterns, ideas, and feelings, so that we can experience it free from our biases. The optimal result of such close reading is a sense of our own self-organization, which becomes, in turn, the basis for increased freedom of action in our mental and social worlds. Freedom, for Richards, stands as a consummate value. As he puts it, poetry gives order and coherence, and so freedom to a body of experience. The poem's structure lifts the individual into a newly expansive, even pleasurable perspective, with an accompanying sense of wholeness and order and of one's own volition. To fill out our picture, we need to add the element of attitudes. For literature influences the reader by invoking and reformulating attitudes. I hope you can't hear the police siren in the background. It's Washington, D.C. By attitude, we generally mean a preconditioned response, thoughts and feelings that are already patterned and organized in advance of the situation. The Merriam-Webster dictionary offers a representative definition of attitude as a settled way of thinking or feeling about someone or something, typically one that is reflected in a person's behavior. Our attitudes are largely both predetermined and generalizable. An example given by Richards is the way that an adult responds to a baby crying, with a sense of immediate concern and an urge to comfort. That attitude or predisposition is general because whatever the particular identity of the crying baby, our attitude is largely the same. We have all sorts of attitudes, some narrow, others broad, attitudes toward love, friendship, commerce, politics, for example, or attitudes of empathy or indifference that we assume. More broadly, we might sometimes adopt a religious attitude, a scientific attitude, or an historical attitude. Works of literature invoke attitudes. Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, Break, 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 discussed by Richards, depends, for example, upon the attitude of grief that we all will share over the loss of a loved one. Poetry not only activates, but also challenges and reformulates our attitudes. When T.S. Eliot writes, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table," he invokes first our feelings of companionship, you and I, and next our typically appreciative attitude towards nature, the vastness of the evening sky, only to displace those values shockingly with a clinical, detached, perhaps even repellent image of an anesthetized human body about to undergo surgery. The first two attitudes evoked in those lines clash disturbingly with the third. Attitudes, then, are about ways to think, feel, and respond, ways to be. And in literature, they become malleable. According to Richards, it is by expanding and reformulating the reader's attitudes that poetry confers coherence, power, and freedom, and thus promotes individual self-realization. Richards treats attitudes as having a further significance because, although an attitude is not an overt physical action, it calls forth in us the kind of muscle memory associated with an action. It is a kind of a vicarious or imagined action. An attitude, then, entails a psychosomatic readiness, such as that disposition we assume when a baby cries. Let me complete this part of my talk by quoting from the last paragraph of Richard's chapter on the analysis of a poem in Principles of Literary Criticism. The after effects, the permanent modifications in the structure of the mind, which works of art can produce, have been overlooked. No one is ever quite the same again after an experience. His possibilities have altered in some degree. And among all the agents by which the widening of the sphere of human sensibility may be brought about, the arts are the most powerful, since it is through them that men may most cooperate, and in these experiences that the mind most easily and with least interference organizes itself. Or to repeat ideas quoted earlier, poetry gives order and coherence, and so freedom to a body of experience. So let me go on to part two. From those broad considerations, let us turn more specifically to the comic attitude, or as the 19th century novelist George Meredith put it, the comic spirit in the plays of Ludovico Ariosto. Ariosto, who lived from 1474 to 1533, stands as one of the greatest writers of the Italian Renaissance. He grew up and resided in Ferrara, where, as both a writer and a diplomat, he served prominently in the court of the ruling Este family. Ariosto is most famous for his romance epic, Orlando Furioso, published between 1516 and 1532, which runs to almost 40,000 lines, the longest poem ever written in Italian. He was also the originator of the vernacular Italian tradition of learned dramatic comedy, commedia erudita. Ariosto is credited, furthermore, with coining the term humanism or umanesimo, so that we might say Renaissance comedy and Renaissance humanism intersect almost at their birth. Ariosto wrote 4 comedies: La Casaria, or The Coffer, from 1508, I Suppositi, or The Pretenders, 1509, Il Negromante, or The Necromancer, 1520, and La Lena, or Lena, 1528. The comedies were known as eruditi, because they were based on the conventions and sometimes the plots of the Latin dramatists Plautus and Terence. All of Ariosto's comedies were staged publicly to great acclaim in Ferrara during Carnival season. As evidence of the ongoing importance of Ariosto in literary studies, here's a picture of a very handsome young Hungarian scholar making a pilgrimage to Ariosto's home in Ferrara. For Elizabethan England, the most famous of these plays is I Suppositi, which was translated or adapted into English by George Gascoigne as Supposes. Performed at the Inns of Court in London in 1566, published in 1573, and with revisions again in 1575 and 1587. It was acted at Oxford University in 1582 and surely elsewhere. Likewise, in 1582, Stephen Gosson, in his plays Confuted in 5 acts, refers to bawdy comedies, notice the plural, translated out of the Italian and performed on the public stage. So Gascoigne's Supposes was apparently not the only Italian comedy, and perhaps not the only one by Ariosto known to Elizabethans. In the printed margins of Supposes, Gascoigne identifies the sequence of false assumptions or suppositions upon which the characters act and that lead them into confusion and error. Gascoigne lists 21 such supposes, often with descriptors such as a doltish suppose, a knavish suppose, a gentle suppose, and the like. Shakespeare adopted certain situations from supposes into The Taming of the Shrew, so he undoubtedly knew the play. In comedies from The Comedy of Errors through Much Ado About Nothing and Twelfth Night, likewise, there are endless examples of comic confusions, mix-ups, and misadventures that are predicated on false assumptions, faulty lines of thinking, or misperceptions about others. In those plays, Shakespeare is interested not only in mistaken supposes, but also in biased or irrational predispositions, that is, ingrained attitudes that necessarily lead characters into error. From Ariosto's I Suppositi, then, one might think that the main principle of the comic attitude would be to question assumptions, to think and act rationally, to keep emotions in check, and to proceed with skepticism, as if the comic spirit could be crystallized in certain humanistic precepts for behavior that we could write on a blackboard. That's all fine, but we might look for a more expansive perspective by turning to some of the other comedies written by Ariosto. I have in mind 2 plays, La Casaria, or The Coffer, Ariosto's first comedy from 1508, and Il Nigromante, or The Necromancer, from 1520, a necromancer being essentially a magician. The plays present 2 sets of attitudes that I want to characterize as wondering in The Coffer and wonder in The Necromancer. Those values include skepticism, but they also take us into new territory. The action of The Coffer transpires in the city of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos near Greece, overseen by the Turks. The plot centers on 2 young men, Erofilo and Caradoro, who are in love with 2 slave girls owned by the procurer Lucrano, who's trying to sell them. The young men are sons of wealthy but parsimonious fathers, so that they lack the money necessary to acquire the girls. The action involves their efforts, principally through the clever lies, tricks, and plots of their servants, to obtain the young women from the procurer, at which they eventually succeed. The coffer referred to in the title is a locked box held by Erofilo's father, full of thousands of ducats worth of gold brocade cloth. The father, Crisobolo, is away, allowing his inventive servant, Volpino, to devise a plot on Erofilo's behalf to steal Eulalia, one of the slave girls, from Lucrano. In Volpino's plot, a friend disguised as a merchant buys Eulalia and gives, as financial guarantee, the coffer full of gold brocade, whose financial value is 10 or 20 times that of Eulalia. The plot works, but then the disguised accomplice is attacked and the girl stolen from him by the servants of Erofilo, who think mistakenly that they are acting in the interests of their love-besotted young master. Then the father, Crisobolo, unexpectedly returns home. The wily Volpino deceives him for a while, but his fabrications eventually collapse, and Volpino is carted away, imprisoned, and in danger of being beaten and hanged. It's a mess. Eulalia is missing, Erofilo is distraught, Crisobolo is enraged, and Vulpino is in chains. Surprisingly, into this chaos steps another servant, Fulcio, whose master is the other love-stricken young man, Cerdoro. Fulcio conceives a plan to terrify the procurer Lucrano into leaving Mytilene without the girls, based on a false story that will put him in fear of persecution by the police and by the governor. Fulcio even comes up with a scheme to extract money from the stingy father, Crisobolo, to pay off the procurer to leave some funds for Erofilo to support Eulalia. The Coffer is a short play full of a lot of complicated action. It is persistently open-ended. Characters forecast possible future outcomes in different, even opposite scenarios. Unexpected complications spring into view just when lines of action seem to have been resolved. Various problems never get quite settled, while the dangers of failure, the threat to life and limb, are made to feel urgent. As the play ends with the girl Eulalia safely in Erofilo's care, the father, Crisobolo, still has no full knowledge of his son's deceptions, nor is it evident that Erofilo has really learned anything or even repented, nor is it clear what will become of the young girl. Within the overall arc of a completed action, the play includes a succession of alternative, failed, and only partial resolutions. That condition squares with other Renaissance Italian comedies and with Renaissance Italian theories of comedy, which show an interest in surprise and incongruity without worrying too much about tidying up all the loose ends. Furthermore, the activities of the characters are riddled with lies, quarrels, and hostilities that constitute a whole sub-layer of the action. Those often unsolved conflicts pit residents against aliens, sons against fathers, servants against masters. Character after character is angling to get an advantage over someone else. Almost everyone lies and steals, as if they were all part of a larger but unacknowledged game. At the end of the play, even the seemingly honest and principled father, Crisobolo, after lecturing his son about virtuous behavior, reveals an unattractive miserliness by resisting the need to give a small amount of money from his considerable wealth to rescue himself and his son from possible litigation and shame. Meanwhile, even the worst characters, such as the self-professed cheat Lucrano, are given sympathetic moments. Differently, the crafty Vulpino may work commendably on his young master's behalf, but he has a cruel streak towards one of his fellow servants, and his colleague, the wily Fulcio, boasts that his lies are making war on his masters. Notwithstanding, those two are the only characters whom the audience is led to admire, if not exactly like, for they display inventiveness, audacity, and an almost inexplicable loyalty to their masters. The Coffer contains a host of tensions that are never fully put to rest. Despite its mixed qualities, the play proves to be hilarious and delightful. It was tremendously well received, celebrated, published, and performed multiple times. With its strong arc of completion and satisfaction, and with the systematic patterning of its loose ends, the play would have met, I think, I.A. Richards' criteria for aesthetic organization. So what is the attitude that this first of all Renaissance learned comedies would impress upon its audience? We are surely bedazzled by the crafty servant, so we get a bit of wonder there. But the larger effect, I think, is of wondering. Actions tend to entail alternatives and never seem quite finished. Characters displace each other and then keep changing in our estimations. Sometimes the sincerity or insincerity of their behavior, such as Erofilo's, defies clear interpretation. One residual effect of the coffer is to force us to look closely, even skeptically. More broadly, the play instills an attitude of satisfaction tinged with uncertainty, an optimism always kept a little contingent, a hopeful expectancy colored by a playful doubt, the attitude that I would call pleasurable wondering. Let me turn more briefly to the ending of Ariosto's comedy, The Necromancer. Written the year after The Coffer, The Necromancer is set in Cremona and concerns a young man, Cintio, who has secretly married the poor Lavinia, but whose father, ignorant of the prior marriage, has forced him to publicly to marry the rich Amelia. In order to keep faith with his beloved Lavinia, Cintio pretends to be sexually impotent with Amelia. The bride's father, Abbondio, upset about his daughter's predicament, prompts Cintio's foster father, Massimo, to ask the necromancer to help in ridding Cintio of impotency through magic. The necromancer is, of course, a charlatan whose goal is to cheat people out of their money. Cintio, in a counterplot, bribes the necromancer to claim that Cintio's alleged impotency has resulted from a prior magical curse, which can only be lifted by the young man's divorce from Amelia. Servants learn of this counterplot and divulge it, to the prospective ruin of the secret young lovers. But fortune intervenes, for it is discovered that poor Lavinia is actually the long-lost daughter of Massimo, Cintio's wealthy foster father, the parent and child having been separated during a Venetian military invasion. Massimo now joyously endorses Lavinia's prior union with Cintio. The alleged curse of impotency is indeed lifted by divorce, and also by the magic of a father's discovery of his missing daughter. Like the coffer, the necromancer has a complicated plot involving multiple characters working against each other for their own interests, with related subplots and deceptions, all impressively well managed by Ariosto. The play, like its predecessor, is full of contingency and surprise as we shuttle from one half-successful subplot to another. Among those devices, there is a rival lover hiding in a box in Amelia's bedroom, reminding one of Cymbeline. In the ending, for a bit of poetic justice, the necromancer's servant, Nebio, ends up bamboozling his master. The con man is conned. One might think of Ben Jonson's The Alchemist. But I'm interested in a further effect, wonder, and with it, forgiveness. Indeed, Ariosto's Necromancer may give us the first instance in a vernacular play of a comic formula that occurs often, if not always, in Shakespeare's comedies, that the experience of wonder leads to forgiveness. That formula is the opposite of what I see in some of Shakespeare's late romances, in which forgiveness leads to wonder. Wonder in the comedies constitutes an attitude, a spirit that can make forgiveness possible. Here, forgiveness occurs as a new eventuality brought into being by wonder. This forgiveness is not inevitable, rationally necessary, or predictable. Together, wonder and forgiveness are values that filter through Renaissance humanism, and they identify the doorstep to which humanist reason leads us before we step through it and into the realm of values that transcend quotidian logic. Renaissance Italian comedy loves surprises, and in The Necromancer, the culminating surprise grows out of the story of the lost child, poor Lavinia, a story that has been buried, but that now, as it is revealed, makes complete sense. When the foster father, Massimo, hears the accusation that Cintio has been secretly married, he's angry, but insists on going into the house and double-checking the facts. "Please don't be in such a hurry," he says to Emilia's father, Abbondio. "Let's find out more about this." When he returns, he behaves a little like the truth-finding Friar Francis in Much Ado About Nothing. Massimo reports that he has listened to Lavinia tell her story, studied her countenance, examined the jewelry left her by her mother, and has deduced from the evidence that she must be his daughter. That recognition has then catapulted him into a state of joyous wonder. Other characters respond to the revelation as Massimo emerges from the house. "Why is he so happy? Oh, great luck! Oh, excellent fortune! The greatest joy, the greatest happiness he could ever have." Massimo himself will acknowledge his newfound joy and great happiness. On the basis of this ecstatically wonderful turn of fortune, Massimo asks Emilia's father, Abbondio, to forgive Cintio's offense and to release him from his public marriage. "I beseech you, if I may, to put up with my happiness and not to object to it. Take back your Emilia." Abbondio consents. For both fathers, the amazing turn of events has revealed a kind of transcendent order, an unfailing divine providence, as Massimo puts it, that cannot be anticipated or grasped rationally. The transcendent order inspires surprise, wonder, and joy, and it generates a shift in attitude, making possible the father's reconciliation of their forgiveness of Cintio. Reconciliation and their forgiveness of Cintio. Wonder opens up the meanings of events. It recreates the characters' attitudes and, by extension, ours too. Again, these effects are consistent with Renaissance Italian theories of comedy, as they will develop through the course of the 16th century. As Antonio Riccoboni puts it in 1585, the laughter induced by comic surprise is a sign of joy, and the mind makes it through a dilation of the heart from the liberation of the spirits. Comic wonder produces liberation of the spirits, or as I.A. Richards would say, the achievement of a certain aesthetic order and coherence induces in its auditors a feeling of freedom. So, wondering and wonder are two related comic attitudes that I would identify in Ariosto. Shakespeare will develop those values extensively. I would not go so far as to claim that Shakespeare took his cues from Ariosto's work. We know too little about how much of Ariosto's writing Shakespeare had encountered, although he was clearly familiar with some of it. What we can claim is that they shared, in some measure, a humanistic comic sensibility. In the spirit of Renaissance comic theory, the plots and subplots in Shakespeare's comedies leave doubts for audiences to ponder, to puzzle over. In the denouement of The Two Gentlemen of Verona, Valentine's sudden, shocking willingness to give away his beloved Silvia to his treacherous friend Proteus suggests that, without intervention, male friendship always threatens to destroy the tranquility of heterosexual marriage, a tension that the play simply cannot resolve. The ending of The Merchant of Venice was once celebrated for its presumed harmony, but recent critics argue that the alien shadow presence of Shylock disrupts the scene inescapably. Shylock has been defeated, but not exorcised. And what will be the fate of Jessica as the daughter of a Jew in a Gentile world? Likewise, many modern productions of the play raise doubts about the viability of the love relationships between Portia and Bassanio and Nerissa and Gratiano. One Royal Shakespeare Company production even turned the ending into a screaming match among the lovers. In Much Ado About Nothing, Beatrice and Benedict never come to understand the trick played on them by their friends. Likewise, those conspirators wrongly think that they are entirely responsible for this unlikely love match. Only the audience members possess the facts fully, but it is never clear whether the romance between Beatrice and Benedict is attributable to their authentic feelings or to social construction. How secure or fragile is this match? Audiences for romantic comedies desire and even expect a happy ending, but in Much Ado, perhaps we are being made to doubt what we are also being made to hope for. We could generate similar conundrums for each of Shakespeare's comedies. These matters are not faults, but features, for the intention of the comic plays is to create an after effect of pleasurable wondering, of interesting doubts and questions that force us to survey the evidence carefully, yet to do so within the arc of our overall satisfaction. Wondering requires spectators to suspend their certainty, and thus it stands not far from the experience of wonder. From the Comedy of Errors to Twelfth Night and All's Well That Ends Well, Shakespeare's comic endings often create moments of wonder, as Shakespearean criticism has long recognized. The social philosopher Jane Bennett, in her book, The Enchantment of Modern Life, argues that moments of enchantment and wonder can induce an attitude of ethical generosity in those who experience them. That is, as she says, the mood of enchantment can be valuable for ethical life. The state of wonder entails a temporary suspension of chronological time and bodily movement that attests to the moment's uniqueness. The experience can involve exhilaration and acute sensory activity so that even as we feel a bit carried away, wonder might prompt us to look closely at the particularities of things and to appreciate their reach and complexity. In the state of wonder, the familiar categories of perception fall away. One feels surprise, sometimes a sense of the uncanny, and certainly pleasure. The mood is of fullness, plenitude, or liveliness, especially as dissimilar objects are newly seen in a network of interrelationships. Those experiences are often attended, argues Bennett, by a feeling of ethical generosity. Let me simply point out some moments of ethical generosity, specifically forgiveness in Shakespeare's comedies, moments that seem to arise out of the experience of wonder. In the ending of The Comedy of Errors, a play to which I've dedicated far too much of my life, the experience of wonder is sustained among a group of characters for some 43 lines, and it produces the Duke's sudden and legally inexplicable pardon of Aegeon. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the group wonder of the waking lovers is induced by the complete dissipation of the anger and violence that had almost brought them to ruin the previous night. In the denouement of the two gentlemen of Verona, wonder produces the Duke's forgiveness of the outlaws. In The Taming of the Shrew, it conditions Vincentio's pardoning of the servant Tranio, who had duped him. And in All's Well That Ends Well, it facilitates the forgiveness of Bertram. Such acts of forgiveness, predicated on wonder, evoke comedy's optimism and even utopianism, and they deliver those values as realistic possibilities back into the field of the everyday. Wonder, as it breaks down categories and barriers, puts us in an attitude of widened receptiveness, of ethical generosity, and it makes new responses such as forgiveness possible. So, as a conclusion to this talk, let me return to the subject of attitude. As I.A. Richards demonstrated, literary experience can break down our habitual ways of perceiving and encourage in us new or different frameworks for response. In the cases of Ariosto and Shakespeare, we have identified two attitudes that their comedies cultivate: wondering and wonder. In wondering, we experience an engaged doubt, an inclination to scrutinize suspiciously and carefully, and the desire to ruminate. Renaissance comedy, with its good-natured tolerance of loose ends, incomplete resolutions, and lingering uncertainties, all occurring inside the larger trajectory of comic completion, seems calculated to produce this attitude of cautious wondering. But likewise, the surprise of comic ending seems intended to generate some level of wonder in its participants and vicariously its spectators, a wonder or awe that can bring in its wake other effects, notably forgiveness, that lead us beyond rationality and make surprising outcomes possible. To invoke Richards, we might say that the shifting impulses of wondering and wonder are calculated to instill in the reader or spectator the kind of organization or rough balance of the psyche that he envisioned as the achievement of literature. We might even find something of Richards' freedom in the spontaneous forgiveness, the ethical generosity that we have noted in the plays. Thus, Richards can help us to outline, by means of Ariosto and Shakespeare, a coherent way of thinking about the humanist attitude of comedy, about how a person can be. Perhaps one might venture to say that what the world needs now is not so much the tragic attitude, but rather the wondering and wonder that are the gifts of the comic spirit. Thank you.